Hey everybody, what's up? Steve here. I've had something on my mind the last couple months that I really want to talk about and kind of get off my chest. And I thought maybe making a video would be the best way to go about it. So here we are. Today we're going to talk a little bit about protest music. So before we get into it, I just want to tell a quick little story. So I can still remember when I was very young in my early teens, like 13, 14, something like that. Coming home from school like I did every single day, I'd throw on Much Music. Much Music is the Canadian version of MTV if you're American watching this. And I would just sit there and forever and just wait for, one of my favorite bands' music videos to come on, or maybe a new top 10 list, something like that. And I can still remember the first time I saw the music video for Rage Against the Machine's Bulls on Parade. It was this weird, like, creepy found footage style video with political messages kind of strewn about it. And I remember it really blowing my mind. Like, it kind of felt like I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to see. Like there was a secret message or maybe, some hidden knowledge that I had stumbled into. So recently, Tom Morello of Rage Against the Machine was on Billy Corgan's podcast, and he told a story about the first time he'd ever shown Rage Against the Machine's music to somebody that he knew. And he had this to say.
And afterwards, we say, "What do you think?" And he stands up and he says, "Your music makes me want to fight." and he had sort of
Nostradamus.
And he had sort of a, like, his posture was that of like a honey badger, when he said it. And we're like, "Oh, well, how about that? That's interesting."
So I thought that story was really great because I remember that's exactly how I felt the first time I heard Rage Against the Machine's music, especially Bulls on Parade, that huge snare going into it, that like super heavy riff in the intro, and the distorted vocals that Rage is kind of known for. It just made you feel like this sort of visceral anger when you heard it. Even though at the time I was too young to be fighting anybody about anything, and I didn't even really know what the band was talking about. But over the years of listening to Rage, you'd kind of slowly start to pick up on things. You'd hear maybe Herbert Hoover mentioned in a song, and you'd think, I think I heard of him, And then you'd hear maybe Zach De La Rocha talk about the Tet Offensive, which is maybe something I'd seen in a movie at one point or whatever. And then you hear maybe about Baldwin in France, and you start to wonder, like, who are these people that they're talking about? I got to look into this. I got to learn more about it. And that was kind of the beauty of the music of Rage Against the Machine. It kind of drew you in and educated you at the same time. So thinking about this kind of got me wondering, where's all the protest music right now? I mean, it seems like all anyone talks about is politics. You can't turn on the TV or go on the internet without being bombarded by some crazy political story or some controversy or some escalating conflict somewhere in the world. And where's all the art, and specifically the music, that is addressing this stuff? I haven't heard a lot in the last maybe, 8 years or so about any of this. And it started to kind of pique my interest. So I have some answers, what I think is going on, but I also need some help, and we'll get to that in a minute. So before I go any further, I just want to address one little thing. So in my opinion, protest music, and specifically political protest music, is at its best when it addresses systemic issues that kind of affect everybody, rather than being, a cat fight between the left and the right, or whatever spectrum you want to put people on. A really good example of this is CCR's Fortunate Son. At this point, we all know it, and we all know it's sort of been attached to the Vietnam War. And it was popular at the time of the Vietnam War, of course, but John Fogerty has come out and said that it's not really about any specific war, really. It's more about general war protest and the idea of, senator sons getting to draft dodge because they have connections, this sort of thing. But because it's so universal, I think that's one of the reasons it's still with us and still one of the most beloved protest songs of all time. So I think that protest music as a concept has probably been around for as long as music has been around, but at least in a modern context, and when we're specifically referring to recorded music, I think it's generally accepted that the golden age of protest music was the 1960s. I mean, it's really not hard to understand why this is true. I mean, the 60s had, Nina Simone, Bob Dylan, CCR, Buffy Sainte-Marie, Sam Cooke, The Impressions, Marvin Gaye, James Brown, Joni Mitchell, even Elvis and Woody Guthrie had political songs in the 60s. I mean, it's not really hard to understand why this was the case. Think of all the crazy things that happened in the 60s. I mean, you had the civil rights movement, you had the Vietnam War, you had the JFK assassination, you had further escalation of the Cold War, you had the moon landing, you had the very rise of counterculture itself, where these post-war baby boomers were kind of coming into adulthood and had a lot of anxiety and frustration about the world and had a lot to write and sing about. So after the 60s comes the 70s, and among other things, we got the oil crisis, the Iranian Revolution. There's the end of the Vietnam War. There's the Kent State Massacre. There's even more escalation of the Cold War. And the music from this time is very anti-war, anti-authority, so you got songs like Edwin Starr's War, Fight the Power, War Pigs, Stand Up for Your Rights, Taking It to the Streets, Working Class Hero, and a lot of Bob Marley's catalog as well. So then we get to the 80s, and this is where things get really cool. I mean, if you're like me and you love punk rock, you got the whole punk rock revolution. So there's the Clash, there's the Sex Pistols, there's the Dead Kennedys, but there's also, Bruce Springsteen, U2, Public Enemy, Grandmaster Flash, more Neil Young, Steve Earle, like the list goes on and on. So now we're in the 90s, and of course we already talked about Rage Against the Machine, hugely popular in the 90s. But there was also the Scorpions, there was Sinead O'Connor, there was the Cranberries, there was George Michael, Pulp, Manic Street Preachers, even Michael Jackson had a protest song in the 90s. And I know I'm leaving out a lot here, but there's just so much, right? Like the 60s had Tom Paxton and Phil Oakes, the 70s had Helen Reddy and Pink Floyd's The Wall, the 80s had Midnight Oil and Nina, like the list goes on and on. Now, an important thing to keep in mind here is when it comes to protest music, popularity really matters. And all the artists and songs that I mentioned, they were all huge hits in their day, right? A lot of them were in the Billboard Hot 100, some were in the top 10 even. Like in the 60s, Sam Cooke hit number 31 with A Change Is Gonna Come on the Billboard Hot 100. Peter, Paul, and Mary and the Impressions both had top 10 hits. Bob Dylan hit number 2 with Blowin' in the Wind. The Shirelles hit number 1 with Soulja Boy in 1961. And this trend continued right into the 1970s. I mean, Edwin Starr's War and Helen Reddy's I Am Woman were both number 1 hits. Imagine, Peace Train, Fight the Power, all in the top 10. These were songs that were so popular, they were keeping up with, just the pop music of the time. And actually, one of my favorite examples of this is the first week that Edwin Starr's War reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The number 2 song that week was Make It With You by Bread. And no shade on Bread, I love Bread, but it's just funny to me to think of those 2 songs kind of back to back on the chart. So at this point, we're at the end of the 90s. We've had decades of great political music that is popular, stood the test of time, still relevant after all these years. But then 9/11 happens. So whenever I've had a conversation about 9/11 with someone who is maybe too young to really fully grasp it, or maybe hadn't even been born yet, I find it really difficult to explain just how much the world changed before and after that event. And I'm not really qualified to diagnose the changes to the global psyche in the wake of 9/11 and the subsequent wars that followed. But at least on a personal level, I can definitely divide my life into pre and post 9/11. So in the wake of this terrible tragedy, something happened that I consider to be one of the greatest acts of censorship the West had ever known. And here's where we got to talk about the Clear Channel Memorandum. So Clear Channel, for those of you who don't know or maybe can't remember, was a huge multi-million-dollar media conglomerate. They owned hundreds of radio stations across the United States. They're still around. We now call them iHeartMedia, which I think most people have heard of. But in the wake of 9/11, they released a list of songs that they deemed too insensitive, basically, to play over the airwaves. And the more you read this list, the more absurd it becomes. And just to give you an idea of how absurd this list is, here's a few songs that were deemed inappropriate to play on the airwaves after the events of 9/11. So you got Hell's Bells by AC/DC. There's 2 Alice in Chains songs on there. There's Down in a Hole and Them Bones. There's Smooth Criminal by Alien Ant Farm for some reason. What a Wonderful World by Louis Armstrong. Walk Like an Egyptian by the Bangles. There's 4 Beatles songs on there. There's A Day in the Life, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Oobla Dee Oobla Da, and Ticket to Ride. There's Mac the Knife by Bobby Darin. And even Jimi Hendrix' Hey Joe made it onto that list. So you may have noticed that none of those songs are really protest songs or anti-American in any way. And how they ended up on this list is honestly anyone's guess. But there's a few more I find a little bit more interesting. So one of them is War Pigs by Black Sabbath, which is an anti-war song, but is in no way anti-American, at least as on its surface. And besides, it's by an English band. There's also The Zombies, She's Not There, which as far as I can tell is just a song about a girl. And then the most interesting one to me is The Clash's Rock the Casbah. And if you don't know what that song's about, it's about the Iranian Revolution when they criminalized rock and roll. And I find that a little bit interesting because the CIA bears some responsibility for the Iranian Revolution. And you could also kind of say that about the terrorists that attacked 9/11. So I just feel like that's a little bit of irony in there. But by far, the two that make me laugh the hardest are Tuesday's Gone by Leonard Skinner and Ruby Tuesday by the Rolling Stones. And you might be wondering, what? Why those two songs? Well, guess what? They both have Tuesday in the title, and 9/11 happened on a Tuesday, so they were added to the list. Oh, and just a quick side note here. In 2008, Clear Channel was involved in a leveraged buyout by an investment fund called Bain Capital. And Bain Capital is the fund started and ran by future U.S. presidential candidate Mitt Romney. So we almost had a U.S. president who had a controlling stake in one of the largest media apparatuses in the country. And good thing that never happened again. So I can remember that at the time, it wasn't lost on people, this irony of, responding to a terrorist attack whose given reason was that they hate our freedoms, and responding to that by mass censorship of music and art across the country. People were well aware of that at the time. But even putting that aside, I think the way we responded to that tragedy by mass censorship of music and art is one of the reasons why we've sort of seen a downward slope of political and protest music in the modern era. Okay, so we've reached the 2000s, and in my opinion, if there's a hero in this part of the story, it has got to be Green Day. Their 2004 album, American Idiot, was a huge hit. I mean, it was everywhere. It was on the charts, everyone was playing it, and it was one of the first overtly political albums that we had that was that popular since the 9/11 attacks. And as someone who taught guitar at the time, I can definitely attest to just how huge this album was. I mean, every student of mine wanted to learn the riffs from American Idiot, Holiday, Wake Me Up When September Ends, Jesus of Suburbia. Like, these songs were just huge. And for a lot of young people, it might have been the first overtly political album they had ever heard in their lives. So Green Day weren't the only ones, of course. NoFX had the War on Errorism record. Great name for an album. Muse had the Resistance record. Propaganda had Potemkin City Limits. Buffy St. Marie had Running for the Drum, which is an album with its own controversies. But you might have noticed that these albums aren't as popular or as in the mainstream as, say, American Idiot or a lot of the other songs that I mentioned before. And you wouldn't be alone in thinking this, because this is the era where protest music and political music kind of starts getting nicheified or, relegated to punk and underground hip hop instead of being in the mainstream as it once was. Now, before anybody says anything, I do know that the music industry in the late 2000s was way different than in previous eras. The whole Napster thing and the internet kind of collapsed the industry. There was no longer one monolithic place to get music from, the radio and the Billboard charts. Nowadays, Billboard has different charts. There's the top 100, top 200. There's the top 10 hot singles, which I'll admit I thought was something else when I looked it up. And even Apple has its own list. Spotify has its own list. There's different lists for genres. So things are different. But what worries me is how difficult it is to kind of track down music with a political message. And I mean, just think of all the crazy stuff that has happened since 2010 alone. I mean, there was the Arab Spring. There was the Occupy Wall Street movement. There was the Black Lives Matter protests. There's been 3 controversial U.S. presidential elections. There was the whole COVID pandemic. There was the January 6th incident. Russia has invaded Ukraine twice since 2010. And where's all the music about this? Where's the art? Where are the people singing protest songs about that stuff? This is the point of this video. I need some help tracking this down. The only song I can really think of that kind of addresses this kind of stuff is Childish Gambino's "This Is America," which checks all the boxes for a great protest song, and it was popular and everyone knew it. But other than that, there's not that many. Okay, so what's the point of all this? Well, firstly and most importantly, I want to hear more protest songs. So I started compiling a list of every protest song I could think of or have run into in the past couple months. That list is on my website. There's a link in the description below. If you can think of anything that belongs on that list, please leave a comment with it. I want to check it out for sure. Or send me a message on Instagram. I want to make this list like very comprehensive. And secondly, if there aren't enough protest songs, then let's write some. I want to hear some new ones. So if you're an artist or in a band that has written some, protest or political music, please let me know. Leave a comment or send me a message. I want to listen to it and check it out, especially if it's about new things that are going on. I'd be very, very interested in listening to some music about that. And I'll probably do a follow-up video to this at some point, maybe going into anything I missed or some new stuff that I've discovered. And there is one song that came out a few years ago that really kind of hit me in a profound way, and I'd really like to talk about it, but that song probably deserves its own video. So hopefully I'll get to that at some point. Anyways, thanks so much for watching and letting me rant here a little bit. I'll see you soon, and let's rock and roll.